Fighting Blindness Canada's Young Leaders program is a career-oriented initiative that provides young people living with vision loss in Canada with the tools they need to develop their skills and pursue rewarding careers. The session you're about to watch is a recording. To learn more about the Young Leaders program, please visit the link in the video description below. The Young Leaders program is proudly supported by RBC Future Launch, Rhythm Pharmaceuticals, and the J.P. Bickell Foundation. We hope that you enjoy the session and share your thoughts with us in the comment section below. Thank you for watching. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, as I just mentioned, to our very first Career Connections, which is a new webinar series that is being presented by our young leaders. My name is Morgan Einesen, and I'm the Manager of Education at Fighting Blindness Canada. I'm a 39-year-old curvaceous white woman. I've got blonde hair and some big blue glasses on, and I have sort of a blue and green flowered shirt. And I identify with she, her pronouns. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we're on today. Here in Toronto, we operate on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. But from coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. As we get started, I'd also like to thank our sponsors who've made this program possible. So a big thank you to RBC Future Launch, Rhythm Pharmaceuticals, and the J.P. Bickell Foundation. So as I mentioned, this is a new series for us, and in each series, we're going to be talking to a special guest about how they got started on their career path, what inspires them, the joys and challenges that they've faced along the way. This is our first session. We're going to be holding one a month from June through September, so I hope you can come and join us for all of them. Our next session is going to be taking place on Wednesday, July 26th, also at 8 p.m. Eastern. And in that one, our co-chair Jacqueline will be in conversation with accessibility leader Brogan Freeborn. So you can sign up for our website, which I will put in the chat if you're interested in that. And my last bit of housekeeping, I'm super excited to announce that just today we've opened registration for our Toronto Young Leaders Summit, which is happening the weekend of October 14th and 15th. Jake and Jacqueline and Vesper and Hamid are working on an amazing program with us, and we'll be offering travel scholarships to help offset the cost of travel. All of the details can be found on our website, which again, I'll put in the chat in just a minute, or you can always email us at education@fightingblindness.ca. All right, so I'm going to pass it over to Jacob Hirst, who's one of our amazing co-chairs this year. So Jake is going to spend probably about 20 or 30 minutes-ish talking with our special guest, Mike Davies, and then we'll open the floor to your questions and conversation. We just ask that you keep yourself on mute until we get to the Q&A. The meeting is being recorded, and just a huge thank you in advance to Mike and Jake for talking with us tonight, and I'm really looking forward to listening. I think that's all for me, so I'm going to pass it over to you, Jake, to get us started.
All right, Morgan. My name is Jacob Hirst. I'm about 25, and I have a retinitis pigmentosa, and tonight we're going to be talking with Mike Davies. I believe he's a sports reporter. And can you tell us a bit about yourself, Mike?
Yeah, so my name, as you say, is Mike Davies. I'll be 56 on July 22nd, which is the day that Danica here is getting married. So congratulations to her. I've been a sports reporter at the Examiner for 31 plus years. I've been a reporter at the Examiner for 31 plus years. I moved into sports in the third year there, and have been covering the Peterborough Petes of the Ontario Hockey League and the Peterborough Lakers of the Major Series Lacrosse League for the last 28 seasons. Cover a lot of other sports. Basically anything that happens in Peterborough in the area of sports is sort of my territory. So cover a little bit of youth sports, adult sports. Kids are, we have a lot of local athletes that are competing at national and international levels that I follow their careers and write stories on them. And yeah, enjoy it a lot. I'm married with my wife, Sue, who's not too far away from me here in the room. And we have a daughter, Sarah, who's 24 and just graduated from Humber College and is starting her professional life now, and she's in the sports management field. I think she got a little bit of love for sports from me. And yeah, I know there's lots more that I can tell you about myself, but I don't want to steal away from some of the questions that Jake has. We'll probably overlap on some of that.
I'm sure we will, Mike. So my next question is, I know you have retinitis, a form of retinitis pigmentosa as well. How did you actually discover you had vision impairment?
I didn't know at all that I had anything wrong when I was a little boy. And my sister, she's a year younger than me. She was experiencing some trouble in grade 1 at school in reading the chalkboard at school. So there was a number of tests that were done on her, and they discovered that she had RP. And of course, it's a genetic disease. So then they tested the whole family because we had no history of it in our family, either on my mom's side or my father's side. And so they tested the rest of the family. I have 2 other brothers, and my sister and I turned out to be the only 2 that tested positive for it. It wasn't affecting me at that stage of my life. I was 11, I believe, at the time that I found out. The doctors told me very bluntly at that time that you will be affected in later life, that it's very unpredictable, that RP is different for everyone who has it. My sister was 10 when we were noticing things with her. I don't think that I really noticed anything until I started in university around the age of 19. And even then it was just subtle. It was just noticing that when I went from a bright sunny day outside into one of the buildings at the university, which was not, it's an old gray university here, or building here in Peterborough. It's called Trent University. A lot of stone building. And when you go inside, it's a little dim. It's not brightly lit. And I would notice going from the outside to the inside that, oh, wait a second, my eyes aren't adjusting immediately to the darker setting that I was in. And so it took me a little bit to figure out, you know what, if I wore sunglasses and I went from the bright outside to the indoor and then took off the sunglasses, my eyes were already adjusted. And so probably for the next 10 years, I didn't really think much more about it. Sunglasses kind of dealt with the transition for me. And it wasn't until I was probably in my early 30s that I then began to know more drastic change. Now at 50, turning 56 soon, I would say it's in the last 5 years that it's become very significant in terms of my loss, having to use computer assistive devices now to help me at work. Started with a white cane about 3 years ago to help me get around better. And yeah, so that's my RP story.
Yes, it's more progressional for you than it would be for other forms.
Yeah, as crazy it sounds to some people, probably not as crazy to all of us who are experiencing vision loss. I'd say that I'm very lucky that I had, 30 plus, even 40 plus years of what I would consider very good vision. And that has certainly helped me to adapt as time goes by. It's more of a slow progression. So I've had to just adapt to things as they've become issues. And I think that if it had been a different situation where I was affected much more severely at a younger age, I don't know how that would have affected my life, but it would have been much more difficult than the way it turned out.
I know you said you're a reporter and you've got into sports reporting fairly early on. Was this something you were always interested in, or did someone inspire you towards it?
I didn't immediately know. I always loved sports. That was probably my number one passion. Sports and music are sort of the 2 things I think that, just as hobbies are things that I would, really spend my spare time on. And I didn't know that it would end up being writing, but so when I got to the age of university age, I thought, well, whatever job I do, I'm going to have a university education. So I just started taking general arts and science classes and not really knowing what it was I was going to do. And, but thinking on the sports side, I was a fan back then of the Peterborough Petes, the team that I now cover. I would go to their games on a fairly regular basis. And so I just thought, I wonder if there's something that I could do in the hockey field. And so I actually approached a gentleman whose name is Bob Pulford. He was the general manager of the Chicago Blackhawks at the time. This is going back, 30 plus years. And I just said to him, what would you suggest that I do if I wanted to get into hockey or get into a sports field? And he said, well, you know what? You've got a team right here in your own hometown. Why don't you go and volunteer your services and see if there's any way that you can help with them and kind of get your foot in the door a little bit? And so I did approach the team, and they just happened to be looking for somebody to do some to be a statistician for them. And so at the age of 19, going to college or going to university, I became a statistician for them. They actually paid me a nominal fee to do it. I traveled with the team and just kept stats during the course of games that the coaches wanted tracked, time on ice, who's wins the faceoffs, who's making hits, who's getting shots on goal, plus minus, all those sort of things. And that was sort of my entry into the sports world. I didn't realize that at that time that sort of networking was going to lead me to my career field. But I ended up, when I was traveling with the team, sitting on the bus right behind Mike Brophy, who was the sports reporter at the time for the Examiner covering the team. And him and I became pretty good friends. And it was just through talking to him and having always had a bit of an ability to write. I'd got some recognition in grade school and high school for some of my writing, creative writing, that I thought, maybe that's my path. And so when I was done university, I applied for an opening at the Examiner that was a part-time news reporter to begin with. Knowing Mike so well, he put in a good word for me. Always helps to know people, for sure. And the Examiner took a chance on a guy that really had no reporting background, and gave me the part-time job to begin with. And 31 plus years later, here I am.
So what do you do in an average day as the reporter? Has there anything that's remained the same or changed over time as your vision has gotten worse?
Well, listen, my job has changed a lot, and the vision has nothing to do with it. The vision certainly affected it, and I can get into that into a second. But just to give you a bit of an idea, I think nobody here would be surprised to hear that the newspaper industry has been struggling in the last 20 to 30 years. Certainly the onset of the internet, the ability for people to get their news in other ways, a lot more competition, has done a lot of damage to the newspaper business. The fact that people could, one of our biggest revenue generators was classified ads. How were you going to sell something to your neighbor or someone in your community, or you're going to have a yard sale or whatever? Well, you took out a classified ad in your local newspaper. Well, when Kijiji came along and offered that service for free, and anybody in the world could see it, not just the people in your neighborhood or your city, that killed a lot of advertising for the newspaper industry. So when I started out, there was 4 of us in the sports department, and we had 30 people that worked in our newsroom. Today, I'm the only sports reporter, and we have 7 people in our newsroom. So that gives you an idea of the cuts that have happened over the years to our industry. So my job has changed quite significantly in the amount of work that I have to do and the amount of things I have to cover. I'm no longer sharing the burden with 2 or 3 other reporters. Basically anything that happens in sports in Peterborough, it falls on me to do. So that is pretty dramatically affected. I used to travel with the teams when I first started for 22 years. I traveled on the road to all the Pete's home and away games with the Lakers team in the playoffs. I would go with them to all their playoff games. And now, because I'm the only guy, the company doesn't want me on the road for 2 or 3 days with the team when there's also stuff that has to be done here. So the traveling with the team changed. And as well, just because the company doesn't have as much money as it used to have, they don't want to spend to send me to, say, for example, the Memorial Cup this year, which was in Kamloops, BC. I had been to 2 prior Memorial Cups when the Petes had won the OHL championship, but they were no longer going to pay for that for me to be away for a week. And so I ended up covering the tournament by watching it on TV and doing everything by Zoom and phone calls afterwards to get my quotes and do my stories. So it's changed pretty dramatically without me having even reference to the vision loss yet. And then moving into that area, probably the first significant thing for me was in 2001, I had to give up driving. That was the first time that I had to go into my boss and explain to him what I was going through. During my job interview, I had told him that I had this retinitis pigmentosa, and at some point in life it would begin to affect my vision, but at that point it wasn't really. So I don't know if he really didn't think much of it, or it didn't certainly affect him from hiring me. but this was, 6 or 7 years into, no, sorry, it was 10 years into working there that I had to go to him and say it is now affecting me and I'm not going to be able to drive anymore. And that was sort of the first hurdle that I had to overcome, I would say. And company was pretty supportive. They said, well, you'll take cabs to assignments and we'll pay for mileage for your wife to drive you to and things when she's available. And that's how we handled the first hurdle. Then over time, and then he said to me in that meeting, and he said, when your sight gets to a point where you can't really see the games that well and it's affecting your ability to cover the games, you're going to have to let us know, because we're going to have to find somebody else to do that and we'll have to reassign you to some other work. And I can tell you that that wasn't something I wanted to hear at the time, because this is what I love to do. And it wasn't something, I didn't want to be a news reporter anymore. I wanted to be a sports reporter. That's why I got into it in the first place, right? So I'm going to be honest with you, as things started to pop up and as I started to notice it was getting a little harder to read the numbers on the jerseys or the names on the back of the jerseys, I didn't tell anybody at first. I started listening to the games on radio. I was lucky that the local games were being broadcast so I could follow along that way. And so if I wasn't sure who the player was with the puck, I just listened to the broadcast and it told me everything I needed to know. As my sight got worse, people that I sat with in the press boxes, people that were off ice scorers and sort of people that work for the team. I'd known these people for quite a long time. They were willing, whenever I had a question, if I was unsure of what just happened, they were willing to answer it without any questions. And then if something happened during a game and I wasn't quite sure of what happened, I'd go to the player afterwards and do an interview with them and just say, hey, how did that goal get scored? Or describe that goal to me. And so, you just learn ways to adapt and keep doing the job. And it did get to a point where I wasn't seeing the players nearly as well and having trouble telling just by sight alone what was happening. So I was relying on these other factors. And so a number of years later, when my boss came to his retirement, I went in and sat in with him on his last day of work and we had a discussion, and he asked me, he says, how are you doing with the eyes and how's it going? And I explained to him, figuring he's on his way out. He can't do anything about it now. I was completely honest with him and told him that I had not really been straightforward with him. And his answer to me was, well, Mike, I noticed things. I could tell, when he would see me in the office or see me at the rink or whatever, he noticed that I didn't see as well as I did before. He said, you walked by me a couple times in the hallway and never said hi to me. And I said, well, that must just be his sight. He didn't realize it was me. He says, but Mike, he says, when I picked up the paper every day and I read your stories, there was no sign that your work was being affected in any way, shape, or form by what you're going through. And I thought to myself, well, if he's able to do the job, then who am I to say that he can't do it?
Yes, it sounds like you've had to face many challenges throughout this, Mike. And you've had that was actually my next question. We're going to address what challenges you've faced throughout your career and how you've had to overcome them.
Yeah, just like anybody on this Zoom call, right? We all have challenges with vision loss, and we all have to meet them in our own ways, right?
Yes. And as you mentioned, you said you disclosed that you did have a vision impairment to your boss on your first interview. Yes. So that addresses how was your employer actually? I know you addressed a bit about this, but how did they help you cooperate or cope with this in any way?
Like in the job interview, I told him about it and he asked, well, how's it going to affect you? And I said, well, it doesn't affect me right now, but, later in life. And at that time, I didn't know how long it would be before it would affect me, especially like when I was 11 years old and was told by a doctor in a doctor's office that this is what I had and it was going to affect my life. And he says, it's going to affect you in midlife. Like, part of me quite honestly believed that he was just wrong and that it would never affect me. And as I got older, when I got into my teens and whatever, and was noticing nothing, I kept thinking, I wasn't really thinking about it much. I was just living my life and I played sports. I played hockey. I played outfield when I played baseball. So, it wasn't like my sight was affecting me, playing sports or anything that I wanted to do. And so I kept thinking to myself, when it would pop into my mind once in a while that I had this RP, apparently, I used to think to myself, well, maybe they're just wrong, right? Like maybe it's a misdiagnosis, or maybe I'm going to be the one that it's not going to affect. Or if it's midlife, well, that's so far down the road. I was thinking midlife was 50 or 60, maybe a bit naively, right? And at that time, when he was interviewing me, I told him, like, it's not affecting me at all, and I really don't know when it will. And I couldn't tell him because I didn't know. And so he didn't really seem that concerned about it at the time and didn't give it much consideration. And it really wasn't until I went to him 10 years later and told him that I was no longer going to be able to drive, that was the first time that we really had a heart to heart about it.
Yes. So you said you retired while you were you're still a reporter, obviously. And how has your new boss taken this?
Yeah, well, they just didn't, they were all people that I'd worked with. There's been two bosses since him retiring. Another one took over for a few years and then retired. So now there's my third boss, I guess, for lack of a better word. But so these are all guys that I had worked with prior, and they just saw me doing my job and didn't think any differently of it. So they didn't make any changes at all when they took over. They just said, keep doing what you're doing.
So I know you've touched on this a bit throughout our conversation, but how did your colleagues react to the fact you had a visual impairment?
Well, at the time, I was just a sports reporter, and we had a sports editor named Bob, and so he was my immediate boss. And then the boss that I was referring to in terms of the job interview and who retired, that was the managing editor. So he was the boss over everybody at the paper. And but the sports editor, who was my immediate supervisor at that time, quite understanding. He said, if you need rides, I'll give you the rides. He wasn't just a sports editor. He loved the sports too. So he was often going to the games that I was going to cover. So he drove me to quite a few things and was always supportive. And they allowed me to start working from home instead of having to come into the office. It would just be a lot easier than trying to find my way into the office every day and then home again at the end of the day. So from about 2001, I started working from home, well before a lot of people in COVID started doing that. We actually closed our offices during COVID, like a lot of companies did, and never reopened. They got rid of the office, and now all of our reporters work from home. But so people have said to me in the last few years, what's it like working from home? And I have to say, well, I've been doing it for 20 years, so it's no difference for me.
Yes, you've been well prepared for it, I guess.
That's right.
And I know we've been touching on this a fair bit. You mentioned you do use some assistive technology throughout your career. Have you faced any challenges with them, and how have they helped you?
Yeah, so quite honestly, it's only been recently. I would say, with I have my computer is a MacBook Pro, so it's an Apple computer, and they have built-in accessibility devices already built into them, so nothing that you have to add. And so I started toying around with them, I'd say maybe for the first time, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, where I started to, what I started to do is using the inversion of colors. So, most computers are set up, and most websites and that, where the text is dark, is black, and everything else is sort of the light color. And I found it was a better contrast to have the black background and the white text. And so that was kind of the first thing that I used in terms of an assistive device, was just that inversion ability. And then I started to use a little bit of the zoom, where you could blow up the size of the computer. If there was one particular thing that you were having trouble with reading, you could blow it up and it would help you read it. But it wasn't like I was using the zoom to read everything. It was only when something I was having trouble with. On the text documents that I write my stories on, I found that if I bolded things and increased the font and used a certain size, that I could get away without having to use anything else beyond that at that time. So those were sort of the initial adjustments that I made, and then just in this past, I would say 6 months or so, it's got hard for me to read the text on the document files. So I'm starting to use a screen reader now to read some stuff to me. Anyone who has used screen readers understands that they are very helpful, but they have their limitations. And so I'm finding that there are some things that they're great to help with, and it is certainly because I've always been able to type. I don't need something where I can dictate the story. I can type quite well, so that's not an issue. But for editing the stories back, I do use the screen reader to make sure that I'm not making any typos and mistakes and catching them that way. But I find that screen reader, on certain websites, the websites aren't maybe made accessible. So the screen reader doesn't always navigate the website very easily. And that can be a little frustrating sometimes to get, the device to read exactly what you want and to skip over all the stuff you don't want to read. I'm sure others on this call have experienced that. Dealing with spreadsheets, the screen reader just will not recognize spreadsheets to go from cell to cell. So when people send me results or things by spreadsheet, I have to say, sorry, you're going to have to send that to me in a document because it's of no use to me. I find now, and you guys might find this a bit too, that people want to send you things by text. They want to send you screenshots of things. And of course, the screen readers can't read images. So I have to always sort of apologize to people when they do that, but say, sorry, but I can't read that. Can you send me, the thing by text? So those are kind of, while they're extremely helpful, and I probably couldn't function without the screenwriter now, I do find that there's some limitations. And so there are some frustrations at times, no doubt.
Yes, there's always some challenges and limitations with technology. I use the maps features as well that you mentioned. They're very helpful as well.
Yeah, and I don't know, quite honestly, maybe there's people on this call that will tell me differently, but I've never used a PC, right? And so I know that for people that have programs that they use on their PC, they have to load those programs onto it in order for them to use them. But perhaps it's possible that some of those programs may be maybe better than the ones that are on the Mac. I don't know, because I've never used anything but a Mac.
So we're going to get into our last few questions here, Mike, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. Overall, is there any advice that you should give to anyone struggling to enter the career path, or that's just beginning with visual impairment? Is there anything, looking back, that you would have done similarly or different?
I thought a fair amount about that question, about whether
Yes.
they would have done different. And, I honestly can't think of anything significantly. The one thing I will say, and I don't know if anybody that's on this call will experience this or not, because I don't know where you are all in your stages of vision loss. But I know that for quite a long time, I tried to hide my vision loss. And I was always worried, what are people going to think? Are they going to think differently of me? Are they going to think he shouldn't be doing that job if he can't see well? I wouldn't say I was embarrassed by it. I was just more concerned about how is it going to affect my career and the way people perceive me. And when my boss retired in 2012, right around that time, I discussed with him about, I was at a stage where, I wasn't seeing people and recognizing them by their faces anymore. I was relying on, uh, certainly the voice is one thing that helps you recognize who it is you're talking to, but you're also, when you come across somebody, you're thinking, okay, now the shape, the size of them, how big they are, where am I right now? I'm in a hockey rink, so this is someone that I know from hockey. So you were using all those sort of things to try and piece together who they are without admitting to them up front that you couldn't see well enough to know who they were, right? So that was kind of where I was at that stage. And then I said to my boss, I says, I think I'm at a point where I would like to write a story, a first person, where I explain exactly what I'm going through. And I thought if I did that, I wouldn't have to explain myself as much to people when I didn't recognize them, or when I bumped into somebody in public because I just didn't see that they were standing there, or whatever. And so I did. I wrote a story in 2012 that I went through everything that I was experiencing. Actually, I ended up winning an Ontario newspaper award for the story. And from that moment on, there was a pretty significant change in my life, because all of a sudden, everybody understood what I was going through and bent over backwards to help me. And not once in the 12 or 13 years that have come since then, have I ever had anybody say to me, you shouldn't be doing the job you're doing, or you're not seeing what's happening out there correctly, or your stories are wrong, you need to get the facts straight. Or, I've never had that, which leads me to believe that I'm still doing the job well. And just, everywhere I go now in the sports community, people will come up to me immediately and say, what can we do to help you? And whether it's going and getting, a lineup or results, or, just finding a seat for me, or grabbing the players that I want to interview, whatever it is. My life is pretty blessed that way, that ever since I wrote that story, I've just found nothing but help. And getting through the arena, for example. So when it's a big crowd, and it's a crowded night, and they've got 4,000 people down at the Peterborough Memorial Center, and I need to get from my press box to the media scouts room, or I need to get to the dressing rooms or whatever, the ushers all know what I'm going through, and they'll say, hey, Mike, come and take my shoulder, take my elbow, I'll get you through the crowd. Not that I can't get through it on my own, using the walking stick and everything. I could probably do it on my own, but it certainly is a lot quicker and a lot easier when they give me a hand. And that's just the experience I've had.
Certainly. So you've found your experience has been better since you disclosed that you had a visual condition to everybody?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Just in the ways that I mentioned.
Yes. All right, then, Mike, it's been lovely talking to you. I'm going to turn it over to the audience if they have any questions they've thought of. I don't know if you're there, Gordon.
I'm here. Hi. Thanks so much. Yeah, so I guess if you want, you can turn your camera, or you can raise your hand and then put your mic on. I see Danica has her hand up, so why don't we jump over to Danica?
Yes, thank you. Great talk, Mike. A lot of it was very relatable to what I'm going through. But I'm curious if you can share maybe one or two of the big highlights of your career so far.
Before I do that, Danica, tell me a little bit about how old you are and what you're doing in terms of school or work or anything like that.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm 27 years old. I'm currently finishing my master's of social work. I have cone rod dystrophy, so I have progressive vision loss as well. And same idea. I was diagnosed when I was younger, but it only really started affecting me in my early 20s. So still that slow progression. I really liked how you spoke about it in terms of you appreciate that it gives you time to adapt, whereas sometimes I forget that and I'm like, this is like a slow death, but sometimes it's like it gives you time to think and adapt. So that was nice to hear. Yeah.
So highlights. Well, as a young kid growing up in Peterborough here, I was a huge hockey fan. First as a Maple Leaf fan, because back in those days, before the internet, before 1,000 channels on cable, when I was 5 or 6 years old, the only hockey we got was Hockey Night in Canada on Saturday nights on CBC, and it was the Toronto Maple Leafs. And so I grew up on Boreas Salming and Mike Palmatier and Daryl Sittler and Lanny McDonald. Those were the players of the day, and those were my heroes. Those were the posters on my walls. And when I played street hockey, those were the players I wanted to be. And then when I was 7 years old, my dad took me to the first Peterborough Pete's game as a young kid. And then in 78, 79, and 80, so I would have been 11, 12, and 13 years old. They won the OHL championship 3 years in a row, and they won the Memorial Cup in 79, right in the middle of that. And so I think when you're a young kid, you're never more a sports fan than when you're in that 10, 11, 12-year-old range. It's the whole world to you, right? And so for the team that was in my hometown to win the Canadian Championship and to win the Ontario Championship 3 years in a row, and to be in the stands for some of those games with my dad and seeing a packed building. That made such an impression on me, and that was a big part of what made me, I think, want to be involved in sports one way or the other. I love sports. I played sports. I was not a great athlete, so I knew I was not going to be a professional athlete, and I had to find a way. Well, sure enough, I end up getting the job with the Examiner, and in 1995-96, I started in sports, and I started covering the Petes. And the Petes had never hosted the Memorial Cup. They had been to it quite a few times, but had never hosted it. And sure enough, the Ontario Hockey League said, this year, we're going to open it up for bids, and any cities that are interested in hosting it have to go and make a presentation to the league committee about why they should be the ones to host it. And so I remember traveling up with the Pete's delegation to this event where they went and presented why Peterborough should host it. And there was 5 other cities that did the same thing. And then they all made their presentations, and then they waited probably about a month or so before a decision was made, and Peterborough was named as the host. And so I thought, wow, I'm not only going to get to go to the Memorial Cup in my very first year covering the team I grew up watching, but it's going to be here in Peterborough for the first time ever. And that brings national attention because the champions from the Quebec League and the Western Hockey League, they both come to compete in it. It brings national attention because TSN broadcasts all the games, so they'd be coming to Peterborough and broadcasting it all. And of course, the national media all pays attention to junior hockey during the World Junior Championships and during the Memorial Cup, and really not much else during the rest of the year. So, to host, to be covering the team, hosting the Memorial Cup here in Peterborough, the team made it to the championship game. Unfortunately, they didn't win for the local fans here. But for a young kid growing up, I thought in my first year, wow, I've already had the highlight of my career in my first year, and it might be all downhill after this.
That's a great story. Hopefully that wasn't the case and it didn't go all downhill.
No. I've been fortunate that the team has got to 2 other Memorial Cups. One I traveled to in Moncton, New Brunswick in 2006. The other I had to cover from home. It was in Kamloops this year. But no, there's been other highlights, but that's the big one for sure.
Are there any other questions? You can just put up your hand, or you can just unmute, whatever works best. Well, if there's someone else, I have a question. I thanks so much for sharing all of this tonight. It's been really interesting to hear you talk about sort of this journey. And I'm just wondering, how have you built confidence in yourself over the years? And do you have any tips for people who might be sort of struggling with their self-image or their confidence?
Yeah, it's a great question, because even when I first started out as a reporter, and you're assigned to go and do a story on something, and you have to go out in public, and now you have to approach people to interview them, and you know, especially when as a news reporter, sometimes you're doing stories that people maybe don't want you to do. You know, you've gone to the scene of a crime or an accident or some, you know, tragedy or some unfortunate event, and maybe the people don't want to talk. You know, I had to get used to that, and it wasn't something I'd really had much of experience in, you know, in sort of approaching people. So I would say I was a touch shy. Not introverted or anything, but maybe a touch shy. And that was a hurdle that I had to get over. And it's just, you know, when they're back at the office expecting a story from you, and your paycheck is going to depend on whether you do the work or not, well, you don't have a choice but to do it, right? And so you just have to force yourself to do something, even if it feels uncomfortable, right? And what I found is that after doing it for a little while, it wasn't as uncomfortable anymore, you know, and you just got used to doing it. And now 30 years later, you don't even think twice about it, right? It's just something you do. And so I know that people maybe who are starting out young now, who are already experiencing vision loss, they have that to add on top of any shyness that they might be dealing with, right? And I would just say that, you know, anything that seems that it's a little awkward or a little uncomfortable to do always gets easier to do over time. And so just force yourself to do it, whether you feel comfortable or not, even if it gives you a little bit of anxiety. The best way to get over it is to do it, and you sort of gain confidence from doing that, right? From learning that, well, wait, I can do that, you know, that it wasn't that hard after all, that, you know, and, you know, I think that's just the thing that gives you confidence over time, is just the repetition of doing things that maybe at one time weren't that easy to do, but get easier as time goes by. Just like learning how to ride a bike, right? You know, or learning how to skate, you know, you're going to fall or trip or whatever the first few times, but the more you do it, the better you get.
A great analogy. Yeah, it's like a case of practice makes, if not perfect, better, more comfortable, right? All the time.
Sure.
Great. So I see some hands. So let's, Vesper, how about you can go next?
Hi, my name is Vesper. I use he, they pronouns. I am from British Columbia, and I'm in my third year of my Bachelor of Arts degree at UBC Okanagan in a combined major of philosophy, political science, and economics. My question is related to kind of your story you shared of how you knew as a young person that you were eventually going to experience vision loss, but it wasn't yet affecting you at that time. What would you tell to your what if you could give a piece of advice to your younger self who wasn't necessarily experiencing day-to-day challenges but knew it was coming in terms of vision loss?
Is that where you find yourself, Vesper?
Yes and no, where I have a neurological condition affecting my vision loss, and so we're not really sure what the future holds for my brain and my eyes.
Right. Yeah, I would say, you know, first of all, try to learn as much as you can. Foundation for Fighting Blindness is a great resource, as you probably already know. I pretty early on, I went a couple of the Vision, was it Vision Quest, or what was the name of the seminar?
Yeah, it was Vision Quest, and now it's Viewpoint. So, but we're still doing them.
Yeah, so I haven't been to one lately, unfortunately. I probably should and get a little more updated on where the science is. But I went to a few early on because I wanted to know, you know, what the hopes were for the future and what was being done in the field. I would say be an advocate, certainly, for your own health. Don't be afraid to go to the doctor, to go to the eye doctor, to if you notice anything different, if you have any concerns, you know, ask questions and push people for answers. I think that there's more resources out there to help than maybe people realize sometimes. So certainly investigate with the CNIB what's available out there for help. There's help to help you get around. There's help to help you find work. There's help to help you within the workplace. There's help to make things easier for you through the CNIB, for example. You know, even if it's just something like having a CNIB card that allows you to get a movie pass that you can then go to the movies with a guide, and your guide gets in for free. Like, a lot of people don't know that those sort of things exist. We have flown on Air Canada, where my wife has gone for free as my guide through a program that CNIB has arranged with Air Canada. There are, for people that get into that are working and that do have a job, there's government disability deductions that you can make on your taxes, where you can get up to $1,500 a year in deductions that come back to you in your tax refund. There are investment programs that the government has, where if you put that $1,500 annually into the government investment program, that they will give you $3,500 back each year that gets invested. And then when you get to your retirement age, then you have access to that money at that point. And You'll never find an investment in any world that is going to give you a rate of return of 3,500 for 1,500. So it's a very useful program. So just learn as much as you can and ask as many questions as you can, because there's a lot more help out there maybe than people realize.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. Whereabouts in BC, Vesper, do you live?
I currently am in Kelowna. I grew up just outside of Vancouver and Surrey.
Right. I've been out to BC 3 times. It's beautiful country out there.
It's quite wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, I think Jacqueline was next.
Hello, my name is Jacqueline. I am 27. I'm from Vancouver, BC, and I'm an early childhood educator.
Nice.
My question for you, Mike, is when, like, I know you talked about how you were always wanted to be a sports reporter. Was there anybody in your life that was a mentor or inspiration for you to pursue your career?
Not initially. You know, when I was a kid, I read a lot of sports stuff, right? Magazines and sports pages. My dad got the Toronto Sun, and I would get the sport. As soon as he was done with it, I'd grab it and turn it immediately to sports. And so I'd read all the sports pages. And so I got to know the names of the sports writers, and I knew who they were, and I saw the styles of writing, and those were things that made impressions on me. But then I would say, you know, probably the guy who became my mentor was Mike Brophy, the guy I mentioned sitting on the Pete's bus, and he was the reporter at that time. How I ended up being able to cover the Pete's was that Mike moved on to, and originally the Hockey News. He was a writer for the Hockey News for quite a while, and then he got hired by Sportsnet, and he was an analyst on Sportsnet. So if you watched NHL hockey games, he would be one of the people in the intermissions that would be talking on the different panels about the sport and what was going on in it. And but certainly he was sort of the guy that sort of opened my eyes as to the possibilities, and he gave me advice and helped me along the way in those early days, and literally by leaving left the door open for me to get into the job that I wanted to do. So I always felt that I owed a debt of gratitude to him for sure.
Danica, I think you have your hand up again.
Yeah, I have another question. So it sounds like obviously hockey is one of the main sports you enjoy covering, but is there a sport that you've covered that you were less familiar with, but you learned a lot about that?
Oh, 100%. You know, like, so I grew up on hockey and baseball. My dad was a big boxing fan, so I knew a lot about boxing. The NBA, I would watch on TV, the NFL, but that's only the major sports, right? And so when I started covering sports in town, you know, there's a rugby club. I didn't know anything about rugby. I didn't know the rules of rugby. I didn't know what a knock-on was. I didn't know, you know, some of the terminology that they use. And so I had to be quite honest with the people. And this was the Jacqueline asked about a mentor. This is, you know, a piece of advice that Mike Brophy gave me was, look, don't pretend to know what you don't know. If you don't know, if you go to a sport and you don't know what the rules are, tell the people that you're there that you don't know the rules and have them explain it to you. The last thing you want to do is write a story about something you really don't understand and get it wrong. And so don't be afraid to admit you don't know it, right? And so I did. You know, I went to the guys who ran the rugby club and I said, look, you know, I'm new to the sport. I got to cover the games. You know, what can you tell me about the rules and how it works? And found that they were more than happy to share their sport, right? And so I've certainly covered sports over the years. Like, I'm not a big golf fan. I do cover golf and go to golf tournaments, but I wouldn't say it's my first love. You know, pickleball is a sport that just in the last few years has really taken off and become something that's really, really popular now. But it didn't even exist when I first started. I'd never heard of it, right? And so there's a sport that's grown up during the course of my career and become as popular as almost any sport that people participate in now. And certainly I had to learn about that sport. I didn't know anything about it, right? And so, yeah, it's been pretty interesting in that way for sure.
Jacqueline, you have your hand up. I don't know if it's still up from before, if you had another question.
Hi, I think it might be from the other question, but I do have a question that came to mind while you were speaking.
Yeah.
I know that you talked about all the sports that you're really interested in and may not know some of them too well and everything, but with players wise, have you ever been like starstruck to, or like, like been, sorry, like been like
I know what you're saying.
less confident to approach them? I don't know.
Yeah, here's an example. There was a very, very unfortunate situation that happened here. Oh, it was 20 years ago. Would have been around 2001 or 2002. And there was a local man named Steve Chason that played hockey in the NHL. He was from Peterborough, grew up here. I actually went to the same high school as him growing up. And he played 10, 12 years in the NHL. And he was killed in a truck crash. His team got eliminated from the playoffs. He played for the Carolina Hurricanes. They got eliminated from the playoffs. He went to a party after that game, and on his way home was killed. And unfortunately, he was drinking and driving, which is terrible. But it was a tragedy, him and his family. And so when they held the funeral here in Peterborough, basically the NHL showed up for his funeral, and I had to cover it. And so, Wayne Gretzky was among the people that was there. Gary Bettman, the commissioner of the NHL. And so Wayne Gretzky, ironically, played 3 games for the Peterborough Petes when he was 14 years old. He was too young to be drafted into the OHL, but the Petes had an affiliation with the minor hockey program that he played for. And so here is this young 14-year-old kid who scored like 1,000 points in his midget year or whatever it was. And so the Petes decided that they would call him up for 3 games and see what he was all about. And so he was at the funeral, and I went to the reception afterwards, and I was interviewing some of the players that knew Steve about Steve and getting some memories about him. And I didn't exactly know what Wayne's connection to Steve Chason was, because they hadn't been teammates to my knowledge. And I also thought, well, Wayne played 3 games for the Petes, and it would be interesting to talk to him about that. But this isn't really the occasion, right? Like, it's a funeral. I don't want to be asking him about his days with the Petes. So, but I did want to know about his connection to Steve and what motivated him to come to the funeral. So it's funny, we were in a room, it was a hall, probably 1,000 people in the room. And there was Wayne and his wife, Janet, sitting at a table by themselves. And I thought, probably everybody else in the room was scared to go over and talk to him too, right? Like, here's the most famous hockey player probably ever. And I was a little bit nervous, but I'd interviewed enough famous hockey players over the years that I wasn't starstruck or totally, but I learned very early on in this job that you want to be professional in everything you do, right? So you try to set any personal feelings you have aside and just try to be a professional. And so I went over and introduced myself, and he invited me to sit down with him and Janet at the table, and I did. And I asked him how he knew Steve, and he said that one of the Canada Cup teams he had played on, that Steve had gone to the training camp, and Steve didn't ultimately make the team, but he got to know Steve there a little bit, and we talked, and I probably spent 10 or 15 minutes with him and had a very nice talk, and asked him if maybe in a different time, in a different place, we could talk about his 3 days with the Petes one day. And he kind of laughed and said, that was a long time ago. I don't know how much I'll remember it, but maybe someday. And so that was probably the most famous person that I've interviewed. And I've never asked anybody for an autograph. I've always tried to keep the lines very professional and just not cross over. But I interviewed a lot of hockey players and baseball players, and some famous people that way. And it's always interesting, and I tell my friends and family about it afterwards, because it's not the usual everyday thing that you come across someone that's that famous. But like I say, you try to just treat it very normally when you're talking with them. And Jacqueline, you said you're an early childhood educator?
I am, yes.
Yeah. How long have you been doing that?
I've been doing it for about 4 years now.
And what is the vision issue that you're dealing with?
Oh, Yes, I have aniridia and a nystagmus.
And how does that
So
affect?
nystagmus is the involuntary movement of the eye.
Right, right. My wife, she's now an education assistant in the high schools, but she started out in early childhood education and actually ran a daycare out of our house while our daughter was growing up. So I just found that interesting. So good for you that you
Yeah,
found.
that's really cool, actually.
Yeah, yeah. And your site hasn't been an impediment to you getting hired and doing the work, obviously.
Yeah, well, actually, I've had aniridia since I was basically born. So I kind of got diagnosed when I was 3 months old. So I have most of my vision, and unless like I really only tell my colleagues if I'm really working with them really closely.
Right.
So, but it's not like I've been hiding it or embarrassed about it either. But it's more
Right.
like I don't really need to tell them if I don't need to.
Right, I understand. I was there at one point for sure. Didn't think it was any
I
other
think
business.
also, over time too is high because I've had vision since when I was really young too.
Right.
Like my vision loss. I mean, it's like it's my normal, so it's like already second nature already. So I don't really found a difference of telling people or not.
Right.
And I just grew confidence over when I actually joined this Young Leaders program in 2019.
In what way?
I don't know. I just grew more confident in like telling people wise and not being as closed off because it does sound like I was embarrassed about it. I wasn't really, but it was just kind of like I didn't really tell many people because everyone was used to it already.
Yeah.
And like knew what I could see and everything. Now that I have to kind of implement a way with the children when see me across the parking lot, I might not greet them because they'll be like screaming hello to me, and I'll be like hello back in a general way and not actually greet them. They want me to.
Yeah, and listen, I think that this program that Fighting Blindness is doing is great because knowing other people that are going through the same thing as you and being able to share those experiences and understanding how they deal with things in different settings as well, like I think it's so helpful for people that are going through any kind of issues, right?
Well, I want to be very mindful of time. We're just past 9 o'clock. But thank you, Mike, for sharing everything. And thank you for all of our participants tonight for such a great and fulsome Q&A. That was really wonderful.